The year was 1887, and the Texas sun blazed mercilessly over the sprawling Double R Ranch, owned by the wealthy and influential Rutherford family. Jake Morrison, a weathered cowboy in his early 30s, adjusted his worn leather hat as he surveyed the vast expanse of land that had become his home for the past 8 years. His calloused hands gripped the reins of his trusty horse Thunder, a black stallion with a white star on his forehead that had saved Jake's life more times than he could count. Jake had earned his reputation as one of the finest ranch foremen in all of Texas. His keen eye for cattle, his ability to read the land, and his unwavering loyalty to the Rutherford family had made him indispensable. But on this particular morning, something felt different. The air carried a tension that made even the cattle restless, their low moos echoing across the plains like warnings of trouble ahead. The Double R Ranch stretched over 50,000 acres of prime Texas grassland, home to over 3,000 head of the finest longhorn cattle in the state. It was a kingdom of dust and dreams, where fortunes were made and lost with the changing seasons. The ranch employed nearly 40 men, from seasoned cowboys like Jake to young ranch hands just learning to rope and ride. Each man knew his place in the carefully orchestrated ballet of ranch life, from the pre-dawn roundups to the late-night watches that kept the cattle safe from predators and rustlers. Rutherford himself was a man of contradictions. Outwardly charming and generous to his community, he was known for his lavish parties and his donations to the local church. But Jake had witnessed another side of his employer, a calculating coldness that emerged during business dealings. Still, Jake had always chosen to focus on his job rather than question the man who paid his wages and provided him with a purpose. As Jake rode through the north pasture that morning, checking on a group of pregnant cows, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks in the dirt, too many to belong to any of the ranch hands, and they led straight toward the river that formed the natural boundary of the Double R property. These weren't the tracks of cowboys going about their daily business. These were the deliberate, purposeful marks left by men who had no business being on Rutherford land. Jake dismounted and knelt beside the tracks, his experienced eye reading the story they told. At least 6 horses, maybe more, had passed through here in the dead of night. The depth of the hoofprints suggested the riders were carrying heavy loads, and the spacing indicated they were moving with purpose, not leisure. Most telling of all, the tracks showed signs that the horses had been shod recently, their iron shoes leaving crisp, clean impressions in the Texas clay. Rising to his feet, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. Cattle rustling had been a growing problem throughout Texas, with organized gangs becoming increasingly bold in their operations. Just last month, the neighboring Thompson Ranch had lost nearly 200 head of cattle to rustlers who struck in the night and vanished like ghosts before dawn. The financial blow had been devastating enough to force the Thompsons to sell their land to Eastern investors. But this felt different. The tracks were too organized, too deliberate. This wasn't the work of desperate men looking to steal a few cattle for quick money. This had the hallmarks of a planned operation, possibly involving someone with intimate knowledge of the ranch's layout and security measures. Jake's mind raced as he considered the implications. Could there be a traitor among the ranch hands? Or was something even more sinister at work? As he remounted Thunder and began following the mysterious tracks, Jake reflected on how much the ranch life had changed over the past few years. The days of the great cattle drives were ending, replaced by railroad connections and more sophisticated business operations. But with progress came new dangers. The old code of the West, where a man's word was his bond and disputes were settled with honor, was giving way to a more complex world where money and influence could corrupt even the most trusted individuals. The tracks led Jake through a section of the ranch he rarely visited, a remote area near the river where the terrain became rough and rocky. Here, among the mesquite bushes and scattered boulders, he discovered something that made his heart pound with alarm. Hidden beneath a rocky overhang was a makeshift camp, complete with the cold ashes of a recent fire and evidence that several men had spent considerable time here. Scattered around the campsite were items that told a disturbing story. Empty whiskey bottles, playing cards, and most ominously, a piece of paper with what appeared to be a crude map of the Double R Ranch, marking the locations of the main cattle herds and the routes used by the night watchman. Someone had been planning an operation against the ranch, and they had been doing it from this hidden vantage point for weeks, possibly months. Jake carefully examined every detail of the abandoned camp, his years of experience teaching him to read the signs like pages in a book. The quality of the supplies suggested the men weren't common drifters or desperate outlaws. These were well-funded individuals with access to good equipment and detailed information about the ranch's operations. The implications were staggering and terrifying. As he prepared to return to the main ranch buildings to report his discovery, Jake heard the distant sound of gunfire echoing across the plains. His blood turned to ice as he realized the shots were coming from the direction of the ranch headquarters, where Rutherford's family lived and where most of the ranch hands would be gathering for the midday meal. Whatever plan had been hatched in this hidden camp, it appeared to be unfolding at that very moment. Spurring Thunder into a gallop, Jake raced across the rough terrain, his mind filled with images of the people he had sworn to protect. The Rutherford family, despite their flaws, had become like family to him. Young Sarah Rutherford, barely 16, with her bright smile and dreams of seeing the world beyond Texas. Mrs. Rutherford, a gentle woman who always had a kind word for the ranch hands and made sure they were well fed during the long working days. And then there were his fellow cowboys, men who had become his brothers over years of shared hardship and danger. Old Pete, who could track a single cow across miles of rocky ground. Young Tommy, just 19 and full of dreams about making his fortune in cattle ranching. Miguel, whose skill with horses was legendary throughout the county. Each of these men trusted Jake to keep them safe, to make the right decisions when danger threatened. As he crested a hill and caught sight of the ranch buildings in the distance, Jake saw smoke rising from what appeared to be the main barn. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed even more ominous than the sounds of battle. His worst fears were being realized, and he knew that the next few hours would test everything he believed about honor, loyalty, and the price of doing what was right. The storm that had been building on the horizon of Jake Morrison's life was about to break with devastating force, and nothing would ever be the same again. Thunder's hooves thundered against the hard-packed earth as Jake raced toward the ranch headquarters, his heart pounding with each stride. The silence that had replaced the gunfire was more terrifying than the shots themselves, carrying with it the weight of unknown tragedy. As he approached the main compound, Jake could see figures moving near the barn, but the distance made it impossible to determine friend from foe. Slowing Thunder to a cautious walk, Jake reached for the Winchester rifle secured in his saddle holster. The weapon had been a gift from his father, passed down through 3 generations of Morrison men who had lived and died by the code of the frontier. Its worn wooden stock bore the scars of countless adventures, and Jake had always found comfort in its familiar weight. Today, however, the rifle felt heavier than usual, burdened by the gravity of what he might be forced to do. As he drew closer to the ranch buildings, Jake began to make out details that chilled him to the bone. The smoke he had seen wasn't coming from the main barn, but from a smaller outbuilding where the ranch hands stored their personal belongings. Several horses that didn't belong to the Double R were tied near the main house, their saddles and tack unfamiliar to Jake's expert eye. Most disturbing of all, he could see at least 3 men positioned around the property, their postures and movements suggesting they were standing guard. Jake made a split-second decision, that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of charging in blindly, he guided Thunder toward a grove of cottonwood trees that would provide cover while he assessed the situation. His years of experience had taught him that a dead hero couldn't save anyone, and whatever was happening at the ranch required careful planning rather than reckless courage. From his concealed position, Jake could see the full scope of the disaster that had befallen the Double R Ranch. At least 8 armed men had taken control of the property, and they moved with the precision of a military operation. These weren't common cattle rustlers driven by desperation or greed. These were professional criminals executing a carefully planned assault on everything Jake held dear. Near the main house, Jake spotted a figure that made his blood boil with rage. Rutherford himself was on his knees in the dusty courtyard, his hands bound behind his back and a gag in his mouth. The proud rancher who had built an empire from nothing was now reduced to a helpless prisoner, his fine clothes torn and dirty, his face bearing the marks of recent violence. Standing over him was a man Jake recognized but had hoped never to see again. Blackjack Mercy was a name whispered in saloons throughout Texas, a former Confederate soldier turned outlaw who had built a reputation for ruthless efficiency and calculating cruelty. Tall and lean, with coal-black hair and eyes like chips of obsidian, Mercy commanded fear and respect in equal measure from both his followers and his victims. Jake had encountered him once before, 5 years earlier, when Mercy's gang had attempted to rustle cattle from a ranch where Jake had been working temporarily. The confrontation had ended, with 3 of Mercy's men dead and the outlaw leader swearing vengeance against the cowboy, who had cost him both money and reputation. Now, seeing Mercy standing in the courtyard of the Double R Ranch, Jake understood that this wasn't a random crime. This was personal revenge. Years in the making, and every person on the ranch was paying the price for Jake's past actions. The weight of guilt settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket, threatening to crush his resolve. But Jake's self-recrimination was interrupted by a sound that drove all other thoughts from his mind. From somewhere within the main house came the terrified scream of a woman, followed by cruel laughter that echoed across the courtyard. Jake's hands tightened on his rifle as he realized that Mrs. Rutherford and her daughter Sarah were inside that house, at the mercy of men who showed no mercy to anyone. Carefully, Jake began to work his way closer to the ranch buildings, using every skill he had learned during his years on the frontier. He moved from cover to cover, taking advantage of every shadow, every building, every fence post that might conceal his approach. His heart hammered in his chest, but his movements remained calm and deliberate. Panic would get people killed, and Jake had already seen enough death to last several lifetimes. As he reached the back of the main house, Jake could hear voices through an open window. Blackjack Mercy's distinctive drawl was unmistakable as he addressed someone inside the room. "Now, Mrs. Rutherford, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I suggest you think carefully before you answer. Where does your husband keep his business records? The ones that show his dealings with the railroad company and the cattle buyers in Kansas City?" A woman's voice, trembling but defiant, responded, "I don't know what you're talking about. My husband's business affairs are none of my concern." Mercy's laughter was like the sound of glass breaking. "Oh, but they are your concern now, ma'am. You see, your husband has been involved in some very interesting business practices. Practices that certain people in Austin would find quite fascinating. But if those records were to disappear, well, that would be unfortunate for a lot of people." Jake felt his world shift as the implications of Mercy's words began to sink in. This wasn't just about revenge or simple robbery. Somehow, Rutherford had become involved in something that went far beyond cattle ranching, something that had attracted the attention of men like Blackjack Mercy. The comfortable world Jake thought he knew was crumbling around him, revealing dark secrets that had been hidden beneath the surface. Through the window, Jake could see into the ranch house's main sitting room. Mrs. Rutherford sat in a chair, her hands bound, while her daughter Sarah cowered in a corner. Two of Mercy's men stood guard while their leader paced back and forth, his hand resting casually on the grip of his pistol. The scene was a tableau of terror that burned itself into Jake's memory. "You know," Mercy continued conversationally, "your husband and I go back a long way. Back to the war, when we both served under Colonel Hayes in the 3rd Texas Cavalry. Of course, I chose to continue fighting after the official surrender, while he chose to come home and build his little empire. But empires have a way of crumbling, don't they, Mrs. Rutherford?" Jake's mind raced as he processed this new information. Rutherford had never mentioned serving in the war, never spoke of his past before establishing the ranch. But if he and Mercy had a history dating back to the conflict, it explained how the outlaw had known enough about the ranch's operations to plan such a detailed assault. Suddenly, Jake heard footsteps approaching his hiding place. One of Mercy's men was making rounds, checking the perimeter of the property. Jake pressed himself against the wall of the house, hardly daring to breathe as the outlaw passed within 3 feet of his position. The man was young, probably in his early 20s, with nervous eyes that darted constantly from side to side. He carried a rifle like he knew how to use it, but his inexperience showed in the way he held himself. As the guard moved away, Jake made his decision. He couldn't assault 8 armed men head-on and hope to save the hostages, but he could even the odds by eliminating the guards one by one, using the stealth and cunning that had kept him alive through years of frontier dangers. It would be risky, requiring perfect timing and absolute silence, but it was the only chance the Rutherford family had. Jake began to move with the patience of a hunting cat, stalking his first target. The young guard had settled into a routine, walking the same path around the buildings every 10 minutes. When he next passed Jake's hiding spot, the cowboy was ready. A swift blow to the back of the head with the butt of his rifle sent the outlaw crumpling to the ground, unconscious but alive. Jake quickly dragged the body behind a water trough, where it wouldn't be discovered immediately. 1 down, 7 to go. But as Jake prepared to hunt his next target, he heard Mercy's voice rise in anger from inside the house. "Your time is running out, Mrs. Rutherford. My patience has limits, and you're rapidly reaching them. Perhaps your daughter would be more cooperative." The sound of Sarah's terrified sob cut through Jake's heart like a knife. Time was running out, and he knew that every minute he delayed increased the danger to the innocent people he had sworn to protect. Jake's heart pounded as he pressed himself against the rough wooden siding of the ranch house, every nerve in his body screaming with tension. The sound of Sarah Rutherford's muffled sobs through the window was like a physical blow, driving home the desperate urgency of his situation. 7 armed outlaws still remained between him and the safety of the people he had sworn to protect, and time was running out with each passing second. Drawing upon years of frontier survival skills, Jake began to formulate a plan that bordered on suicide but offered the only hope of success. He would need to use every advantage the familiar terrain could provide, turning the ranch he knew better than his own reflection into a deadly maze for the invaders who had dared to violate his sanctuary. Moving with the silent grace of a mountain cat, Jake worked his way around to the equipment shed where the ranch hands stored their tools and supplies. His intimate knowledge of every building, every shadow, every potential hiding place on the Double R property was about to become his greatest weapon. Inside the shed, he quickly gathered items that would serve his desperate mission. A coil of rope, a hammer, several horseshoe nails, and a can of coal oil that the men used to maintain their equipment. Jake's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. He would create a series of distractions designed to draw Mercy's men away from the main house one by one, picking them off in isolated confrontations where his superior knowledge of the terrain would give him the advantage. It was a strategy that required perfect timing, absolute silence, and more luck than any reasonable man should expect. The first part of his plan involved the ranch's water tower, a tall wooden structure that provided pressure for the irrigation system and the main house's plumbing. Jake had helped build that tower 5 years earlier, and he knew every beam, every joint, every potential weakness in its construction. More importantly, he knew that it commanded a view of the entire ranch complex, making it an irresistible position for any military-minded leader like Blackjack Mercy. Creeping through the lengthening shadows of the late afternoon, Jake made his way to the base of the water tower. The wooden ladder that led to the top was worn smooth by years of use, and Jake climbed it with the quiet confidence of a man who had scaled its rungs hundreds of times before. At the top, he found exactly what he had expected. One of Mercy's men stationed as a lookout, his attention focused on the approaches to the ranch rather than the possibility of attack from below. The lookout was an older man, probably in his 40s, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. His rifle lay across his knees as he scanned the horizon, completely unaware that death was climbing toward him from below. Jake felt a moment of regret for what he was about to do, but the sound of another terrified scream from the main house hardened his resolve. Jake's approach was silent as a ghost's whisper. Years of working around skittish cattle had taught him how to move without creating the slightest disturbance, and he used every bit of that skill now. When he was close enough to smell the tobacco smoke from the lookout's cigarette, Jake struck with the swift efficiency of a rattlesnake, one powerful arm wrapped around the man's throat while his other hand clamped over the outlaw's mouth, preventing any cry for help. The struggle was brief but intense. The lookout was no amateur, and he fought with the desperate strength of a man who understood his life was on the line. But Jake had the advantages of surprise, leverage, and desperate motivation. Within seconds, the outlaw went limp in his arms, unconscious from the chokehold that Jake had applied with precise pressure to the carotid artery. 2 down, 6 to go. But Jake's victory was tempered by the knowledge that his actions had committed him to a path from which there could be no retreat. He had crossed the line from defender to aggressor, and every outlaw he removed from the equation would make the remaining ones more dangerous and desperate. From his elevated position atop the water tower, Jake could survey the entire ranch complex and assess the positions of the remaining outlaws. 3 men were stationed around the main house, their positions chosen to provide overlapping fields of fire that would make any direct assault virtually impossible. 2 more were near the corral, apparently preparing to steal the ranch's best horses as part of their escape plan. The 6th man was harder to spot, but Jake eventually located him near the barn, probably serving as a lookout for the group's rear approach. Using the rope he had brought from the equipment shed, Jake fashioned a pulley system that allowed him to lower the unconscious lookout to the ground without creating any noise that might alert the other outlaws. Then he began the second phase of his plan, one that would require him to become a ghost, haunting his own property. Jake had noticed that the 2 outlaws near the corral were engaged in animated conversation, their attention focused on selecting the horses they planned to steal. They had positioned themselves near the main gate, probably intending to have their escape route ready when Mercy gave the signal to withdraw. Their tactical position was sound, but it also isolated them from immediate help from their companions. Descending from the water tower with the same silent skill he had used to climb it, Jake began to work his way toward the corral. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the ranch yard, providing him with ample concealment as he moved from building to building. His heart hammered in his chest, but his movements remained calm and controlled. Panic was the enemy of precision, and precision was the only thing that would keep the Rutherford family alive. As he drew closer to his targets, Jake could overhear their conversation, and what he heard sent chills down his spine. "Mercy's getting impatient," one of them was saying. "If that woman doesn't talk soon, he's gonna start doing things that can't be undone." The other man, younger and clearly nervous, responded, "Maybe we should have just taken the cattle like we planned. This business with the family, it don't sit right with me. "You getting soft, Bobby?" the first man sneered. "Because if you are, Mercy's got no use for soft men. Remember what happened to Thompson when he started having second thoughts?" The younger outlaw fell silent, but Jake could see the fear in his posture. Whatever had happened to the man called Thompson, it had clearly served as an effective warning to anyone who might consider abandoning the gang. But fear could be a two-edged sword, making men unpredictable and potentially more dangerous. Jake had positioned himself behind the feed trough, close enough to strike, but still concealed from view. He could smell the horses' sweat and hear their nervous whickering as they sensed the tension in the air. Animals always knew when violence was approaching, and the horses were no exception to that ancient truth. The cowboy's plan required him to take both men simultaneously, a feat that would test every skill he had learned during his years on the frontier. He had the advantage of surprise and superior knowledge of the terrain, but he would be facing two armed men who were already on edge and ready for trouble. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the gunfire would alert every outlaw on the property. Jake checked his weapons one final time. His rifle was loaded and ready, but it would be too loud for this kind of work. Instead, he would rely on his Colt .45 revolver, a weapon that had saved his life more times than he could count. The gun had been a gift from his mentor, an old cowboy named Sam Houston, who had taught Jake everything he knew about surviving on the frontier. Sam had always said that a man's character was revealed not by how he lived, but by what he was willing to die for. Today, Jake Morrison was about to discover exactly what kind of man he truly was. The moment had arrived, and Jake Morrison felt time slow to a crawl as adrenaline flooded his system. Every detail around him seemed to crystallize with supernatural clarity. The nervous stamping of horses in the corral, the whispered conversation between the two outlaws, the distant sound of Blackjack Mercy's voice continuing his interrogation of Mrs. Rutherford. Jake's entire world had narrowed to this single point in time, where the next few seconds would determine the fate of everyone he cared about. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Jake rose from his concealment behind the feed trough with the fluid grace of a predator. His Colt .45 appeared in his hand as if by magic, the familiar weight providing a strange comfort in the face of overwhelming odds. The two outlaws were still focused on their conversation about horse selection, completely unaware that death was standing less than 10 feet away from them. "Gentlemen," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who had nothing left to lose, "I suggest you put your hands where I can see them." The reaction was instantaneous and predictable. The older outlaw, a grizzled veteran with quick reflexes, spun toward Jake's voice while reaching for his pistol. The younger man, Bobby, froze like a deer caught in a hunter's sights, his face a mask of terror and confusion. In that split second of chaos, Jake made the calculations that would determine who lived and who died. Jake's first shot took the experienced outlaw center mass, the heavy .45 caliber bullet spinning him around and dropping him to the dusty ground with a wet thud. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the ranch yard like thunder, announcing to every person within a mile that the battle for the Double R Ranch had begun in earnest. Bobby, the younger outlaw, had managed to draw his weapon, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. "Please, mister," he stammered, "I don't want to die. I got a wife and baby back in Arkansas. I just needed the money." Jake could see the fear in the young man's eyes, could read the desperation of someone who had made terrible choices, but wasn't yet beyond redemption. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, the two men stared at each other across the corral, each holding the power to end the other's life. "Then drop the gun and ride out of here," Jake said, his voice softer but no less determined. "Take one of those horses and don't look back. This is your only chance." But before Bobby could respond, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the air, and the young outlaw crumpled to the ground with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had found its mark. Jake spun around to see another of Mercy's men positioned near the barn, already working the lever action on his rifle for a second shot. Jake dove behind the water trough just as the second bullet splintered the wooden post where his head had been a moment before. The horses in the corral were screaming with terror, rearing and bucking in their panic. The careful stealth of Jake's plan had evaporated in an instant, replaced by the chaos and carnage of open warfare. From inside the main house, Jake could hear Mercy's voice roaring with rage. "What the hell is going on out there? Rodriguez, get over here and find out who's shooting up my operation." Jake knew he had only moments before the remaining outlaws would converge on his position. The element of surprise was gone, and he was now facing a desperate fight for survival against overwhelming odds. But he had succeeded in reducing the enemy numbers, and more importantly, he had announced his presence to the Rutherford family. They now knew that help was coming, even if that help consisted of one lone cowboy against impossible odds. Peering around the edge of the water trough, Jake spotted the rifleman near the barn, attempting to work his way closer for a better shot. The outlaw was moving with military precision, using cover effectively and advancing in short rushes that made him a difficult target. This was no common criminal, but a man with professional training in the art of warfare. Jake's mind raced as he calculated angles and distances, drawing upon years of hunting experience to predict his enemy's next move. The rifleman would need to cross an open space of about 20 feet to reach the next piece of cover, and in that moment of exposure, Jake would have his chance. The cowboy steadied his revolver against the wooden trough, taking careful aim at the spot where he expected his target to appear. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat seemed to quiet, and the world narrowed to the simple geometry of trajectory and timing. When the rifleman made his move, Jake was ready. The shot was perfect, catching the outlaw in mid-stride and sending him tumbling into the dust. But Jake's moment of satisfaction was short-lived as he heard the sound of running footsteps approaching from multiple directions. Mercy had clearly decided to end this threat quickly and decisively, sending his remaining men to surround and eliminate the lone defender. "Jake Morrison!" Mercy's voice carried across the ranch yard, filled with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. "I should have known it was you. Still playing the hero, I see, but you're outnumbered and outgunned, just like you were 5 years ago. The only difference is that this time, innocent people are going to pay for your stubbornness." Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the true scope of Mercy's plan. This had never been about simple robbery or even personal revenge. Mercy intended to use the Rutherford family as leverage to force Jake into surrendering, and then he would execute everyone anyway to ensure there were no witnesses to his crimes. "You want me, Mercy?" Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. "Then let the family go and face me like a man, unless you've gotten so old and soft that you need to hide behind women and children." Mercy's laughter was like broken glass scraping against stone. "Oh, I intend to face you, Morrison. But first, you're going to watch what happens to people who get in my way. Mrs. Rutherford, I hope you've made peace with your maker because your cowboy friend has just sealed your fate." The sound of a woman's scream from inside the house drove Jake to his feet, despite the danger. He couldn't hide behind cover while innocent people suffered for his actions. Whatever the cost, whatever the odds, he had to act. As Jake prepared to charge across the open ground toward the main house, he heard a sound that stopped him in his tracks. From somewhere in the distance came the thunder of approaching horses. Many horses, moving fast and heading directly toward the ranch. For a moment, hope flared in his chest as he wondered if help was finally arriving. But as the riders came into view, Jake's hope turned to despair. These weren't rescuers or lawmen. These were more of Mercy's men, at least a dozen additional outlaws arriving to reinforce the assault on the Double R ranch. The odds, already impossible, had just become utterly hopeless. Mercy's voice rose in triumph as he spotted the approaching reinforcements. "Well, well, Morrison, it looks like the cavalry has arrived, and they're on my side. I do hope you're ready to watch everyone you care about pay the price for your interference." Jake Morrison had faced long odds before, had stared death in the face and refused to blink. But as he watched a small army of outlaws surround the ranch he had called home for 8 years, he wondered if this time his luck had finally run out. The next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but the lives of every innocent person caught in the crossfire of his war with Blackjack Mercy. As the dust cloud from the approaching riders grew larger on the horizon, Jake Morrison felt the weight of impending doom settle over him like a burial shroud. 12 additional outlaws would bring Mercy's total force to nearly 20 men, creating odds that no amount of skill or determination could overcome. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Jake's resolve only hardened. If this was to be his last stand, he would make it one that would be remembered for generations. The reinforcements rode into the ranch compound with the confidence of men who believed victory was already assured. Their leader was a massive bear of a man with a black beard streaked with gray, carrying a sawed-off shotgun across his saddle. Jake recognized him from wanted posters that had circulated throughout Texas. Iron Mike Sullivan, a former Union cavalry officer turned outlaw whose gang specialized in bank robberies and train holdups. But as Jake watched the new arrivals dismount and take positions around the ranch buildings, he noticed something that gave him a spark of hope. These men weren't moving with the coordinated precision he had expected from professional criminals. Instead, they seemed nervous, constantly checking their weapons and glancing toward the main house where Mercy was holding his hostages. There was tension in their ranks, the kind of friction that could potentially be exploited by a clever opponent. "Morrison!" Mercy's voice boomed across the ranch yard. "I'm going to give you one last chance to be reasonable. Throw down your weapons and walk out here with your hands up. Do that, and I promise the Rutherford family will die quickly. Keep fighting, and I'll make sure their suffering lasts for hours." Jake's response was delivered not with words, but with actions. Rising from behind the water trough, he fired 3 quick shots at the outlaws who had taken positions near the main house. The bullets didn't find their intended targets, but they accomplished something equally important. They scattered Mercy's men and forced them to seek better cover, disrupting their careful positioning and creating the chaos that Jake needed to survive. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out among the familiar buildings and landmarks of the Double R Ranch. Jake used his intimate knowledge of every hiding place, every sightline, every potential advantage to stay one step ahead of the men hunting him. He moved like a ghost through the gathering darkness, striking from unexpected angles and vanishing before his enemies could respond. The old equipment shed became a fortress where Jake held off 3 attackers, using the narrow doorway to limit their ability to coordinate their assault. The grain silo provided an elevated position from which he could rain down accurate fire on outlaws trying to cross the open courtyard. Even the chicken coop became a tactical advantage when Jake drove a dozen terrified birds into the faces of 2 outlaws, creating enough confusion for him to escape what should have been a fatal trap. But despite his tactical successes, Jake was fighting a losing battle against simple mathematics. Every bullet he fired brought him closer to running out of ammunition. Every minute that passed increased the likelihood that one of his enemies would get lucky with a shot, and most importantly, every second of delay increased the danger to the innocent people he was trying to save. Inside the main house, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Jake could hear fragments of conversation that painted a terrifying picture of what was happening to the Rutherford family. Mercy's patience had finally reached its breaking point, and he was beginning to make good on his threats of violence against his hostages. "Still nothing to say, Mrs. Rutherford?" Mercy's voice carried a tone of malicious enjoyment that made Jake's blood boil. Perhaps your daughter would be more talkative. She's such a pretty little thing. It would be a shame if something were to happen to that pretty face." Sarah Rutherford's terrified sobs cut through Jake's heart like a knife, driving him to take risks that bordered on suicide. He had to end this siege before Mercy's threats became reality, even if it meant sacrificing his own life in the process. The code of the frontier was clear. A man protected the innocent, no matter the cost to himself. Jake's desperate gambit began with a torch made from a broken fence post soaked in coal oil. If he couldn't defeat Mercy's army through conventional tactics, perhaps he could use fire to even the odds. The ranch's hay barn was positioned downwind from the main house, and a fire there would create enough smoke and confusion to provide cover for a direct assault. Creeping through the darkness toward the barn, Jake encountered two of Sullivan's men standing guard. These outlaws were clearly uncomfortable with their assignment, constantly shifting their weight and peering nervously into the shadows. They were expecting trouble, but they weren't prepared for the kind of silent death that had been stalking them all evening. Jake's approach was a masterclass in frontier stealth, learned through years of hunting dangerous predators in the wilderness. When he struck, it was with the swift precision of a mountain cat taking a deer. The first guard never knew what hit him, crumpling to the ground with barely a whisper. The second managed a strangled cry before Jake's powerful hands closed around his throat, cutting off both sound and breath. Inside the barn, Jake lit his improvised torch and touched it to several piles of hay scattered around the structure. The dry grass caught fire immediately, sending flames racing toward the roof with hungry intensity. Within minutes, the entire building was engulfed in a roaring inferno that painted the night sky with orange and red. The effect on Mercy's men was immediate and dramatic. Outlaws who had been confidently hunting Jake through the ranch buildings suddenly found themselves exposed by the firelight, their positions revealed to anyone with the skill to take advantage. More importantly, the smoke from the burning barn began to drift toward the main house, creating the cover Jake needed for his final assault. But as Jake prepared to charge across the courtyard toward the house where the Rutherford family was being held, he heard something that stopped him cold. From the direction of the main road came the sound of more horses, but these riders were different from Mercy's reinforcements. They were moving in formation, their horses' hooves beating a rhythm that Jake recognized from his days serving with the Texas Rangers. The first rider to emerge from the darkness wore the distinctive badge of a United States Marshal, his Winchester rifle held at the ready as he surveyed the chaotic scene before him. Behind him rode a dozen deputies, all armed and clearly prepared for battle. Jake's desperate message, sent earlier through young Tommy, who had escaped during the initial attack, had finally reached the authorities. "This is United States Marshal Robert Hayes," the lead rider called out in a voice that brooked no argument. "You men are surrounded and outnumbered. Throw down your weapons and surrender, or face the consequences." Mercy's response was swift and vicious. "The hell with you, Marshal. We've got hostages, and if you try to take us, they're going to die." But Jake could see something in the outlaws' behavior that suggested their confidence was cracking. Sullivan's men, in particular, were clearly having second thoughts about their involvement in what had started as a simple revenge operation and had escalated into a pitched battle with federal law enforcement. The next few minutes would determine whether justice would prevail or whether the innocent would pay the ultimate price for the sins of desperate men. Jake Morrison, battered and outnumbered but not defeated, prepared to make his final play in a game where the stakes couldn't be higher. Marshal Robert Hayes was a legend in Texas law enforcement, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his skill with a gun and his unwavering dedication to justice. At 52 years old, he had seen every form of criminal activity the frontier could produce, from simple cattle rustling to elaborate schemes involving corrupt politicians and railroad barons. But as he surveyed the burning chaos of the Double R Ranch, even his experienced eyes widened at the scope of the disaster unfolding before him. The marshal had received Jake's desperate message just as he was preparing to retire for the evening in the nearby town of Cedar Creek. Young Tommy Rodriguez, one of the Double R Ranch hands, had ridden his horse nearly to death, bringing word of the attack to the authorities. The boy's terrified account of Blackjack Mercy's assault on the ranch had galvanized Hayes into immediate action, and he had gathered every available deputy for what he knew would be a dangerous mission. Now, seeing the burning barn casting hellish light across the ranch buildings while gunfire echoed from multiple positions, Hayes realized he was facing one of the most complex tactical situations of his career. Mercy's gang held hostages in the main house, making a direct assault impossible. Unknown numbers of outlaws were positioned throughout the ranch complex, and somewhere in the chaos was Jake Morrison, the cowboy whose message had brought help, but who might already be dead. "Spread out, boys," Hayes ordered his deputies in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Take positions around the perimeter, but nobody moves without my signal. We've got innocent folks in that house, and I won't have their blood on our hands because someone got trigger-happy." The deputies were all experienced men, veterans of numerous encounters with desperate criminals who preferred to shoot their way out of trouble rather than face a judge and jury. They moved with professional efficiency, establishing a cordon around the ranch buildings that would prevent any of the outlaws from escaping while avoiding positions that might endanger the hostages. From his position behind the remains of the water trough, Jake watched the lawmen deploy with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Help had arrived, but the situation remained desperately dangerous. Mercy was cornered now, and cornered animals were always the most vicious. The outlaw leader would know that his chances of escape were rapidly diminishing, making him increasingly likely to carry out his threats against the Rutherford family. Inside the main house, the tension had reached a breaking point. Jake could hear Mercy's voice raised in angry conference with his remaining men, their discussion clearly focused on their rapidly deteriorating tactical position. The arrival of federal law enforcement had changed the entire dynamic of the situation, transforming what had been a personal vendetta into a potential death sentence for every outlaw involved. "Boss, we need to cut and run," Jake heard one of the outlaws arguing. "Take what we can and get out before they tighten the noose." Mercy's response was filled with cold fury. "Nobody runs until I say so. We came here for a reason, and we're not leaving empty-handed. If I'm going down, I'm taking Morrison and the whole damn family with me." Marshal Hayes, meanwhile, had positioned himself where he could observe the main house while remaining protected from gunfire. His years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated how desperate criminals might react when trapped. The irregular muzzle flashes from the house's windows, the occasional shouts of argument between the gang members, the ominous silence that followed each outburst, all pointed toward a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. "Blackjack Mercy," Hayes called out, his voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. "This is your last chance to end this without more bloodshed. Release the hostages and surrender, and I guarantee you'll make it to trial alive." Mercy's laughter echoed from the house, tinged with madness and desperation. "You want them, Marshal? Come and take them. But I promise you, the first lawman who steps into my sight is going to watch these innocent folks die screaming." The stalemate that followed was perhaps the most dangerous moment of the entire siege. Hayes had enough firepower to storm the house and overwhelm Mercy's remaining men, but the cost in innocent lives would be catastrophic. Mercy, for his part, was trapped with no viable escape route, but retained enough leverage through his hostages to prevent the marshal from taking decisive action. It was Jake Morrison who broke the deadlock, emerging from the shadows with a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on one's perspective. Moving carefully to avoid being shot by either side, he approached Marshal Hayes's position and quickly outlined a strategy that would require perfect timing and considerable luck. "Marshal," Jake whispered urgently, "I know every inch of that house. There's a root cellar that connects to the kitchen through a trapdoor that most folks don't know about. If you can create a distraction to draw their attention to the front of the house, I can get inside and even the odds." Hayes studied the cowboy's face in the flickering light from the burning barn. Jake Morrison looked like he had been through hell, his clothes torn and dirty, his face bearing the marks of combat, but his eyes still burned with determination. This was a man who would keep fighting until his last breath, and Hayes recognized the type from his own reflection in the mirror. "That's suicide, son," Hayes said quietly. "Even if you make it inside, you'll be outnumbered and surrounded. One man against that many in close quarters, the odds are terrible." Jake's smile was grim but determined. "Marshal, I've been fighting terrible odds all my life. Besides, those people in there are my responsibility. I let Mercy onto this ranch because of my past with him, and now innocent folks are paying the price. I can't stand by and watch while they suffer for my mistakes." Before Hayes could respond, the situation took another dramatic turn. From inside the house came the sound of a single gunshot, followed by a woman's terrified scream. The sound cut through both men like a physical blow, and Jake felt his world tilt on its axis. Had Mercy finally made good on his threats? Was Mrs. Rutherford or her daughter already dead because of his inability to end this siege quickly enough? "That's it," Jake said, his voice hard as granite. "I'm going in. Give me 5 minutes, then create your distraction. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, do whatever you have to do to end this." Marshal Hayes grabbed Jake's arm as the cowboy prepared to move toward the house. "Morrison, if you're determined to do this fool thing, at least take some backup. I've got men who—" "No," Jake interrupted firmly. "This is personal between Mercy and me. Too many people have already died because of our history. I won't risk any more lives on my account." As Jake disappeared into the shadows, heading for the root cellar entrance he had helped dig 5 years earlier, Marshal Hayes made his own preparations for what he knew would be the final act of this deadly drama. He had seen enough violence in his career to recognize the look in Jake Morrison's eyes, the expression of a man who had made peace with the possibility of death in service of something greater than himself. The next few minutes would test the courage of everyone involved and determine whether justice would triumph over vengeance in the Texas darkness. The root cellar beneath the Rutherford house was a place Jake Morrison knew intimately, having helped excavate it during his second year working for the Double R Ranch. The narrow tunnel that connected it to the kitchen had been Mrs. Rutherford's idea, a practical solution for storing preserves and root vegetables where they would stay cool during the brutal Texas summers. Now, that same tunnel would serve as Jake's pathway into what might well be his tomb. Crawling through the cramped space on his hands and knees, Jake could hear the muffled sounds of argument from the main floor above him. Mercy's men were clearly divided about their next move, with some arguing for escape, while others advocated for a final, desperate stand. The disagreement gave Jake hope that the gang's unity was fracturing under pressure, creating potential opportunities for a single determined man to exploit. The trap door leading from the cellar into the kitchen had been designed to be nearly invisible when closed, its wooden surface matching the floor planks around it. Jake pressed his ear against the underside of the door, listening intently for any sound that might indicate someone was in the kitchen. What he heard instead was a conversation from the adjacent parlor that made his blood run cold. "I warned you what would happen if you kept refusing to cooperate, Mrs. Rutherford," Mercy's voice was saying, filled with malicious satisfaction. "That shot was just to get your attention. The next one goes into something more vital unless you start talking about your husband's business records." A woman's voice, trembling but still defiant, responded, "I've told you 100 times. I don't know anything about my husband's business affairs. He never discussed such matters with me." Mercy's laughter was like the sound of glass grinding against stone. "Oh, but I think you do know, madam. You see, your husband and I have a history that goes back to the war, and I know exactly how his mind works. He would never have gotten involved in the kind of deals I suspect without having some insurance, documents that could protect him if things went wrong. And if such documents exist, his dear wife would know where to find them." Jake's mind raced as he processed this new information. Whatever business Rutherford had been involved in, it was serious enough to attract the attention of a dangerous outlaw like Mercy, and important enough to risk attacking a ranch and taking hostages. The implications were staggering, suggesting a level of corruption that went far beyond anything Jake had imagined. Carefully, Jake began to lift the trapdoor, raising it fraction by fraction to avoid any sound that might alert the outlaws to his presence. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint light filtering in from the parlor, and Jake could see that it was currently unoccupied. This was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to get inside the house and attempt to rescue the hostages. As Jake emerged from the cellar like a ghost rising from the earth, he could see into the parlor through the open doorway. The scene that greeted him was worse than his worst nightmares. Mrs. Rutherford sat bound to a chair in the center of the room, her face pale with terror, but her posture still dignified despite her circumstances. Her daughter Sarah cowered in a corner, tears streaming down her face as she watched her mother being threatened. Mercy stood over Mrs. Rutherford with his pistol drawn, while two of his men flanked the room's windows, keeping watch for any sign of Marshal Hayes's deputies. A third outlaw, who Jake didn't recognize, was positioned near the front door with a rifle. The odds were 3-1 in a confined space where any gunfight would likely result in innocent casualties. But Jake had one advantage that Mercy's men couldn't anticipate: his intimate knowledge of the house's layout. He knew every creaking floorboard, every door that stuck, every piece of furniture that could provide cover or concealment. This house had been his second home for 8 years, and now that familiarity would become a weapon. From outside, Jake could hear Marshal Hayes beginning his distraction, calling out demands for surrender while positioning his men to create the impression of an imminent assault on the front of the house. The psychological pressure was having the desired effect, as Jake could see the outlaws becoming increasingly nervous, constantly glancing toward the windows and whispering urgent consultations. "Boss, we need to make a decision," one of Mercy's men said urgently. "That marshal's got us surrounded, and it's only a matter of time before he tries to rush us. Maybe we should take the woman and the girl and try to fight our way out." Mercy's response was swift and vicious. "Nobody moves until I get what I came for. This isn't just about money anymore, it's about settling old scores. Morrison cost me everything 5 years ago, and now he's going to watch these people pay for his interference." Jake felt the weight of guilt settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Every person in this room was in danger because of his past conflict with Blackjack Mercy, and it was his responsibility to get them out safely. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Jake began to move through the darkened kitchen with the silent grace that had kept him alive through countless dangers. The first phase of his plan required him to reach the main staircase without being detected, a feat that would allow him to attack from an unexpected angle. But as he crept toward the parlor door, Jake stepped on a loose floorboard that had always squeaked under pressure. The sound, barely audible to most ears, was enough to alert one of the outlaws to his presence. "What was that?" the man near the window hissed, spinning around with his gun ready. Jake had a split second to make a decision that would determine the fate of everyone in the room. He could retreat back to the cellar and try a different approach, but that would give Mercy time to potentially harm the hostages. Or he could press forward and trust in his speed and accuracy to overcome the odds. The choice, when it came, required no thought at all. Exploding from the kitchen doorway like a force of nature, Jake caught the outlaws completely off guard. His first shot took the man by the window center mass, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor. His second shot shattered the oil lamp that provided the room's illumination, plunging the parlor into almost total darkness. What followed was a deadly dance of shadows and muzzle flashes, as four men fought for their lives in a space barely large enough to contain such violence. Jake used his knowledge of the room's furniture to maximum advantage, rolling behind the heavy oak table that Mrs. Rutherford used for her sewing, then moving to a position behind the grandfather clock that had stood in the corner for as long as anyone could remember. Mercy's voice cut through the chaos, filled with rage and triumph. "Morrison, I should have known you'd find a way to spoil my party, but you're too late to save anyone. It's time to finish what we started 5 years ago." The outlaw leader's next words would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. "Mrs. Rutherford, I want you to know that your death is Jake Morrison's fault. He could have prevented all of this if he had just minded his own business." The sound of Mercy's gun being cocked was like a death knell in the darkness, and Jake knew he had only seconds to prevent a tragedy that would destroy him emotionally, even if he survived physically. Everything he had fought for, everything he believed in, came down to this single moment of truth. In the split second before Blackjack Mercy's finger tightened on the trigger that would end Mrs. Rutherford's life, Jake Morrison moved with the desperate speed of a man who had nothing left to lose. Years of frontier survival had honed his reflexes to an almost supernatural level, and he called upon every bit of that deadly skill now. His Colt .45 roared in the darkness, the muzzle flash illuminating the parlor like lightning in a midnight storm. Mercy's scream of rage and pain echoed through the house as Jake's bullet found its mark, not killing the outlaw leader, but shattering his gun hand and sending his weapon spinning into the darkness. The sound of Mrs. Rutherford's sobbing relief mixed with Sarah's terrified cries created a symphony of human emotion that would be burned into Jake's memory forever. But the battle was far from over. Mercy's remaining man, positioned near the front door, had recovered from his initial shock and was now returning fire with desperate accuracy. Bullets splintered the grandfather clock that sheltered Jake, sending splinters of wood flying like deadly rain. In the confined space of the parlor, every shot seemed to echo with the thunder of artillery. "Morrison!" Mercy's voice, distorted by pain but still filled with murderous intent, cut through the gunfire. "You think you've won. This is just the beginning. I know secrets about your precious Rutherford that will destroy everything you think you know." Jake's response was delivered with bullets rather than words, forcing Mercy to seek cover behind the heavy oak sideboard that held Mrs. Rutherford's collection of fine china. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that he was destroying the domestic tranquility he had spent 8 years protecting. But sometimes destruction was necessary to preserve life. Outside, Marshal Hayes heard the renewed gunfire from within the house and knew that Jake's desperate gambit had begun. The lawman's own plans swung into motion with military precision as his deputies began their coordinated assault on the remaining outlaws positioned around the ranch buildings. The sound of gunfire erupted from multiple points around the compound, creating the chaos and confusion that Jake needed to complete his rescue mission. Inside the parlor, Jake was engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with Mercy's last remaining guard. The outlaw was clearly experienced in close-quarters combat, using the room's furniture and shadows to maximum advantage. But he made the fatal error of underestimating Jake's knowledge of the house's layout. When the outlaw moved to what he thought was a position of tactical advantage behind Mrs. Rutherford's piano, he exposed himself to a shot from an angle he hadn't anticipated. Jake's bullet found its target with grim finality, and the last of Mercy's guards crumpled to the floor with a wet thud. Now only Blackjack Mercy himself remained, wounded but still dangerous, somewhere in the darkness of the bullet-torn parlor. "It's over, Mercy," Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who held all the advantages. "Your men are dead or captured, and you're bleeding like a stuck pig. Surrender now, and you might live to see a judge." Mercy's laughter was weak, but still tinged with malice. "You think this is about robbery, don't you, Morrison? You think I came here for cattle or money?" The outlaw's voice was growing weaker as blood loss took its toll. "This was always about justice, my kind of justice. Your precious Rutherford isn't the respectable rancher you think he is." From her position tied to the chair, Mrs. Rutherford spoke for the first time since the shooting had begun. Her voice was trembling but determined. "Mr. Morrison, please don't listen to him. He's trying to poison your mind with lies." But Mercy wasn't finished with his revelations. "Tell him about the railroad deal, Mrs. Rutherford. Tell him about the bribes your husband paid to force the Thompson family off their land. Tell him about the cattle that was stolen and rebranded to build this empire you're so proud of." Jake felt his world shift as the implications of Mercy's words began to sink in. The Thompson Ranch that had been sold to Eastern investors after mysterious cattle losses. The railroad spur that had been built to serve the R Ranch instead of following the original planned route. The political connections that had always seemed to benefit Rutherford in his business dealings. Could it be possible that the man Jake had served loyally for 8 years was not the honorable rancher he had appeared to be? "Even if what you're saying is true," Jake said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart, "that doesn't justify what you've done here tonight. Innocent people have died because of your need for revenge." Mercy's response was cut short by the sound of boots on the front porch as Marshal Hayes and his deputies finally stormed the house. The lawman moved with professional efficiency, securing the building and checking for any remaining threats. When Hayes entered the parlor, his lamp illuminated a scene of devastating destruction, but also ultimate triumph. Mrs. Rutherford and Sarah were alive, traumatized but unharmed. Jake Morrison stood over the wounded form of Blackjack Mercy, his smoking gun still in his hand. The outlaw leader was unconscious from blood loss, but still breathing, ensuring that he would live to face trial for his crimes. "Hell of a thing, Morrison," Hayes said as he surveyed the bullet-torn room. "Hell of a thing. You saved these people's lives tonight and probably prevented a lot more bloodshed if Mercy's gang had been allowed to continue their operation." But Jake's victory felt hollow as he considered Mercy's accusations about Rutherford. Even if the outlaw had been lying, the seeds of doubt had been planted, and Jake knew he would never again be able to look at his employer with the same unquestioning loyalty. As dawn broke over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison stood in the courtyard of the R Ranch and watched as the wounded were treated and the dead were prepared for burial. The siege was over, but its aftermath would echo through the lives of everyone involved for years to come. Marshal Hayes approached Jake as the cowboy prepared to tend to his horse Thunder, who had waited patiently through the entire ordeal. "Morrison, I've been thinking about what that outlaw said concerning Rutherford. If there's any truth to those accusations, there's going to be an investigation. You might want to consider whether you want to be part of it or distance yourself from this ranch." Jake nodded slowly, understanding the implications of the marshal's words. The simple world he had known, where right and wrong were clearly defined, and a man's loyalty was given to those who deserved it, was gone forever. In its place was a more complex reality, where even heroes could have feet of clay, and justice sometimes came at a price too high to calculate. As he mounted Thunder and rode slowly away from the ranch he had called home for 8 years, Jake Morrison carried with him the knowledge that he had saved innocent lives and faced down overwhelming odds in defense of what he believed was right. But he also carried questions about the true nature of honor and loyalty that would follow him for the rest of his days. The story of Jake Morrison's stand at the Double R Ranch would be told and retold throughout Texas for generations, growing in the telling until it became legend. But for the man himself, it was simply the day when he learned that sometimes doing the right thing meant questioning everything you thought you knew about the people you served and the world you lived in. In the end, that might have been the most important lesson of all.